Serious nurses, hospital workers of Reddit. What is the most paranormal weirdest thing you have ever experienced while working? Story 1. ER nurse. Had an old lady come in by ambulance, near passing. She was a DNR, so we weren't going to do much for her. She didn't have any family that we could find. The hospital was full, so we had to keep her in the ER for the night. Again, she was near passing. When you've seen enough people die, there's no mistaking it, and she was almost there. Barely responsive, pale, cool, breaths were really irregular. Heart rate was up and down, too. We just turned the lights down and kept an eye on her monitor, basically waiting for her to die. About an hour later, she's standing at the door of her room. She'd gotten up and put on all her clothes. We were all like, WTF? One of the nurses went to check on her and she said she was hungry. Not knowing really what to make of things, we got her a chair, a bedside table, and went to the cafeteria and got her a tray of food. Lady sat there, ate all her food, talked with the staff a little. After about an hour, she told her nurse that she was tired and wanted to lie back down. We helped her back into bed, and within 30 minutes she was dead. Not exactly paranormal, but in 22 years in busy jerk, inner city ERs, it's the weirdest thing I've seen. Edit. After reading all the comments, apparently this isn't all that unusual. Still, I think it was remarkable in that she was so close to arresting before she rallied. Either way, it's the one thing that's always stuck with me. Answer. Something similar happened to my grandmother. Not to that extreme, though. She was 98 and in hospital very sick. DNR, too. She spent a week unconscious almost the whole time. Then she rallied, got so much better it was incredible. The day of her discharge, early in the morning, she slipped back into unconsciousness and died an hour or so later. The family all think she just needed to say her goodbyes. Story 2. Used to work in a skilled nursing facility. I was usually assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. One night I'm in the linen room stocking my cart, and I heard someone shuffle up behind me. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around and there was no one else in the room. The door was still shut too. Another lady started to complain that a man was coming into her room at night. Again, Alzheimer's, so I didn't think much of it. So, to reassure her, I told her I'd check on her throughout the night. She complained of this man for every night for 2 more weeks when I asked her to describe him to me. He's real handsome and wears a black suit. Oh, he's right behind you now, honey. That freaked me the fudge out. Of course, there was no one behind me. She died the next night in her sleep. Story 3. LPN here. I work in long-term care currently. A lot of palliative residents always claim to hallucinate, either small dogs or it's either children eating ice cream before they die. It's always facility-specific too. One facility I work at, I have had about 6-7 residents claim to see a little girl eating ice cream, then they die that night. I'm going to find that little shoot. She is causing me so much paperwork. Answer. Out of interest, do the patients overhear you discussing this? I'm sure that to some extent the elderly and terminally ill are aware of their impending passing and that there's some conscious will involved some of the time. My grandmother told me that she was going to see the stars not long before she died, even though she'd been expected to make a full recovery and was due to be airlifted for surgery. I found her choice of words strange, as she was pretty religious and completely omitted any mention of God. I can see how an idea could be planted in the minds of other patients that people dream of dogs and then die, so that those who intuitively know that they're near passing then report similar dreams. Story 4. In the morgue at my hospital, I would always hear knocking coming from inside the freezer. It really creeped me out, especially when the pathologist looked up, grabbed me by the shoulders, stared me straight in the eye, and said, "You hear that?" You never open that door when they're knocking. Never. It turned out to be some loose pipes. He thought it was hilarious I didn't sleep that night. Story 5. I might be a bit late to the party. I'm an RN, and while I was a student, I was caring for a lady who had end-stage renal failure, had a DNR, and was shutting down. We were having a little chat when she stopped, looked over my shoulder, and said, "Bill's here, love, I've got to go," and swiftly stopped breathing. Read her old notes, and Bill was her deceased husband. Story 6. About 2 years ago, we treated patients during a fungal meningitis outbreak. Our acute care floor has a census of 20. During this, at least 10-15 were meningitis patients, age ranging from 20s to 90s. There are no shared rooms, and all the patients were in isolation, no contact with one another. Many of them had the same hallucinations, children in the corners of their rooms, and auditory hallucinations of religious music. Answer: I had bacterial meningitis and had similar hallucinations. Kids' voices talking to me, people walking around my room staring at me like I was naked in a train station. My dad later assured me he was the only one there. It continued randomly for a few weeks after I left hospital. I put it down to all the substances they were giving me, but it seriously fudged me up for a while. Story 7. I did my clinical as a CNA in a memory care unit. I helped feed this woman. She never really moved, never talked. It was like she was in a coma or something. I would wheel her into the dining room. I can hardly get any real food in her. I'm able to slide in some special ice cream. For days, she doesn't move or have any response. I'm feeding her and talking to myself, pretty much. After about 10 minutes, she slowly turns her head and says, "Oh, hello." Then she rotates her head back her blank staring position. Super creepy. Story 8. When I was a student, I got called in on a stroke patient. She had coded and they were doing CPR. They worked for 45 minutes, but she died. They cleaned her up and called on the family to say goodbye. By the time the family left, she had been both brain dead and without a pulse for more than 45 minutes. Blood had filled her brain, and she was completely gray and started to smell. Suddenly, she sat up and called for her family. The nurses rushed to get monitors and equipment back on her. Started working on her again. She stabilized, said goodbye to her family, and promptly died a second. Time. Story 9. Night nurse for 4 years now at an old folks' home. Had a palliative who couldn't sleep because of incredibly vivid hallucinations. She would describe voodoo people around her room that would just stare at her, waiting for her to die. I didn't take it seriously until the lady across the hall, who rarely ever spoke, starting seeing them in her room too. Legitimate shivers. Answer: I was looking after a patient who needed one-on-one care when I still worked at one of the public hospitals, who had vivid hallucinations of people crawling on the floor and touching the feet legs of anyone not in bed. She went on to describe in great horror story-type detail the person she saw touching my feet while I sat in a chair next to her for part of my shift. It was actually made worse by the fact that she was a moderately good storyteller, and the fact that I knew she was mentally ill, actually hallucinating, and not just pulling my leg for something to pass the time. Edit. Fixed a word. Story 10. Used to work in a personal care home. A couple of times, a day or so after a resident had passed, their call bell would go off in their room. No one was in the room when the call bell went off on any of the occasions. We had one resident die pretty traumatically. Nurses had to perform CPR because he was a full code. That night, the midnight staff said they saw him at the end of the hall, just walking down like he always did. Then the alarm on the door to the outside, it was a secured unit for Alzheimer's dementia, went off. It was the door he always tried when he was looking to get out. Answer: The other day, we had a patient on my floor, DNR, thankfully, die around 3 a.m. A few hours later, his call bell went off and everyone freaked out. Turns out it was just housekeeping unplugging the bed, which sets off the alarm. However, we've had multiple dementia patients say they see children playing in one specific room on the unit. That's freaky as hell to hear at 3 in the morning. Story 11. I work in a cardiovascular surgical ICU. We have a lot of fudge-up people, both physically and mentally, that come through our unit. We had a stretch of nights where each corner room of our unit, it is a perfect square, reported seeing a cat walking around. Not a friendly cat either, apparently. The thing was hissing at them. The accounts were so similar to each other, we actually spent probably a half hour looking around for a cat, and then had security plan ops come look as well. No cat was ever seen or found. 2 of those 4 patients coded the next day. Story 12. Never anything paranormal, but I had an older patient who kept every piece of paper from ever hospital stay. His heart was in bad shape, so I was desperately looking for anything to help our cardiologists out. I finally found his records from when he had heart surgery. It was in Paris, CA, in the 1980s. I was just reading a book about nurses who became serial killers, when sure enough I see records with the name Robert Diaz. I was the nurse for a man whose former nurse was a serial killer. Story 13. Therapist in an acute long-term care facility. We have 4 main hallways. A lot of the action is on 302B. Residents will hear this little boy laugh. Some see him, some just hear. They play with him and let him sit on their laps. It's very strange to see how comfortable a 98-year-old woman feels when talking to a little boy ghost. Grandma instincts kick in, I guess. Story 14. I work a stroke telemetry floor on the bot shift. Most of our patients are elderly. Apparently, there are 2 things that patients see before they pass away. Some will say that 2 men are walking in their rooms and telling them to get ready to leave. The patient will call and tell us that these men are big and abrasive in their demeanor. They are either terrified or annoyed when they see the 2 men. The other thing they will see is a little boy who will go into their rooms and try to wake them up. The boy is usually loud and runs around their rooms. The patients will call and ask who's letting children just run around late night. Several nights, or even that same shift, we're coding or cleaning the patient for the funeral home to pick up. Story 15. My town has 2 really old hospitals. One no longer functions as overnight, and the stories are unsettling. No one cleans the old ER alone because all the lights and call bells go off. On other floors, there's a kid with his ball, a lady in a white dress, etc. A coworker was cleaning an entire floor utterly solo, the norm, and bounced between rooms because the cleaning solution stays wet for a few min. Upon returning to a freshly wiped bed, handprints were clearly visible. Edit: yes, Hotel Dieu and KGH, so many creepy stories in this city. Story 16. Patient had passed away during my shift. The patient was well known and liked on the ward. At handover that evening, I mentioned the patient had passed away. The door to the handover room, which I had closed, opened and shut, just as I mentioned she had passed away. She was totally saying goodbye. Later that month, on nights, we were chatting about said patient at the nurse's station. Weirdly, a card which was pinned on a notice board fell just as we started talking about her. Went to pick it up. It was a card from the patient's family saying thanks for caring their parent. I thought it was quite nice. Story 17. Not my personal story, but when my mom worked as an ER nurse, a guy came in from a car accident and was losing blood. In the midst of resuscitation, the man jolts awake and screams, "Don't let me go back there. Please, 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 don't let me go back." A A few seconds later, they lost him. Story 18. Memory Care Unit. I'm a CNA. We have a room that's a solo bed at the end of the hall with a woman who cannot move her body. She's pretty far gone memory-wise, so when her call light goes off, it's terrifying to go reset it. She can't push it. We blame the cat a lot, but several times it was locked in another room. Story 19. I work midnights in a long-term care facility as a nurse's assistant. I have 2 men under my care, and both of them are unable to use their call lights. They have severe dementia and debilitating Parkinson's disease, but still their lights are looped around their bed rail. One night, their light came on, and I went to answer it, already confused, and creeped out. I turned it off and left the room. Before I could get 2 doors up, the light came back on. I went in there, and both lights were unplugged from the wall and thrown under their beds. I fished them out, plugged them back in, and left. I've seen shadows standing over the dying and felt a tap on my shoulder while doing chest compressions, so I knew that lady had passed. I'm not a believer, but some of those things can't be explained. Story 20. I was pulling a guard shift in the CHS on Forbes Spiker on night in Iraq. There hadn't been any action for the whole previous week, so the staff was all racked out. I was walking the halls and everything was supposed to be off or on standby. I walked past one room that they used for locals who were victims of trauma. The lights were on, so I toggled the switch down to turn them off. I started walking down the hall again, and I saw the lights come back on out of the corner of my eye. This is when I went into alert mode. Safety off at low ready. I cleared the corner and looked into the room. Nothing. I put the switch back in the down position again and went to call it up on the ICOM. The radio was on the fritz, so I began walking back to the CQ desk to report it in person. The lights turned back on. At this point, I'm a little on edge. I can't radio in for help. There is nobody on this side of the compound that would hear me yell, and the light switch position keeps changing when the lights go back on. Keep in mind that I'm on a forward operating base in a combat zone. I don't know what I was expecting when I went to clear the corner and look into the room again, but I saw nothing but an empty room, a gurney, a heart monitor, and a crash cart. I couldn't tell you to this day why I said what I did, but I was worried that if I didn't, the lights would keep switching back on. I said, "If you're scared of the dark, I'll leave the light on for you." I finished my shift and left the light on. I left a note with the desk that one of the surgeons had asked me to always leave that light on, just in case they had an emergency come in. For the remainder of my shifts, that light had always remained on. Story 21. This might get buried and is not really nurse-related other than the fact my grandmother's nurses told me. My great-grandmother was 94 and just started suffering with dementia. She told the home nurses and I that there was a little boy in the corner of the living room who would taunt and tease my great-grandmother while laughing at her, telling her she was going to die. Well, at first it was a little disturbing, and we all shrugged it off because of her dementia. But then shoot got real when my best friend came over with his little boy, who was about 3 or 4. The little guy pointed over to the same corner and yelled, "I'm going to beat you up." When we asked him what that was about, he told us that he saw another little boy in the corner, and he is not nice. We flipped the fudge out. I got shivers just typing this. Maybe Nana wasn't hallucinating. Story 22. I work as an EMT, and the one that I have that best fits the question is an elderly male who had fallen and hit his head a few hours before they called for an ambulance. The guy was Fudge. All of the signs of a traumatic brain injury. All of his responses to our questions to this point were nonsensical. We were about 4 minutes from the hospital when we tried talking to him again, and he seemed to come as clear as day and open his eyes and stare at us to say, "I'm dead." My partner tries to say, "Oh, don't say that." And he stares more intensely at us to reiterate and say, "No, I mean it, I'm dead." He died an hour later. Story 23. Nurse here. I worked night shift when a ward patient's relative came running to the nurse's station in a panic. "Nurse, come quick," she cried. "What happened?" "You have to see it for yourself." I ran to the ward when this little old lady patient was crying and holding on to the bed for dear life. Her bed was shaking. Now you're probably thinking that the lady was the one causing all that shaking. But she was this frail, practically emaciated thing. She couldn't have barely rattled the bed rails. The ward had only 2 other patients in it and their respective watchers. Everyone was huddled in a corner, shaking in fright. Apparently, that particularly ward was seldom used, and the bed that old lady lay in was rarely occupied. People who have laid in it complained of nightmares where they hear screams and laughter of angry children. I guess some restless spirit called dibs on that particular bed. Story 24. A co-worker of mine is cursed. We work on the med-surg unit in my hospital, and for the last 12 deaths on our floor, she has been working. But she has never been the nurse taking care of those patients. We're keeping a tally now. After passing 4, it was funny. Now, at passing 12, it's scary. I personally never believed in that mumbo-jumbo before this. But now every time she is on with me, I watch my patients like a fudge hawk, just in case. Story 25. Worked at a hospital doing transport for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done and supplies are also sorted there. I dislike working late nights after this incident. On this particular night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. I poked my head around the corner expecting to see my only co-worker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Next thing I know, I hear a loud bang. I walked into the hallway and a bed is rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides. At this point, I think that my co-worker is bullshitting me. I radio him and he says he's upstairs in the cafeteria. I still don't believe him and think I'll catch him in the act. I walk past the laundry room and the machines start. Pop my head in there expecting to find him, but it's completely empty. Okay, starting to get a little nervous. I walk into the laundry room and the machines completely stop. I freeze, then run out and head towards the elevator when I hear whistling again. At this point, I know I am the only worker in the basement. As I am standing there waiting for the elevator, things start falling off of the shelves down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packages of tubes. I am literally standing there watching them fall off one by one at the opposite end of the hallway. I shoot you not. My entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on end and I had this strong gut feeling I was being watched. I was not alone. As I'm getting into the elevator, I feel what feels like someone brushing my arm. Went upstairs and found my coworker in the cafeteria, freaked out to him. I got the fudge out of there and transferred soon after that. The creepy thing to add to it is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It was almost as if the spirit was mimicking me. Creepiest feeling ever. Edit. Transferred to the operating room soon after that, I was part of an emergency C-section where a baby was lost. My co-workers and I occasionally heard a baby's cries in the hallways at night. The security workers have also witnessed crazy things, but my post is getting long now. Story 26. First story. Patient had been in CCU, where I work at the time, for a long period of time, 6 months. We had finally been transferred to med-surg floor, and he coded. We worked on him for 45 minutes to an hour, and he had no pulse or heart rhythm the entire time, and the docs had decided to call it, and his family walk in the room, leans over him and rubs his chest lightly and says his name, and immediately regains a pulse and regains consciousness. Second story. Patient comes in coding and we are working on him, and we are getting nothing. So we bring in his wife to say goodbye, and she starts yelling at him at the top of her lungs, and he comes back. So we arrange transfer to a tertiary hospital, and he codes again. So she comes back and yells at him again, and comes back again. Cut to, they are loading him into the helicopter, and he codes again. So they bring him back into our ER after working on him for a bit on the helipad, and his wife yells at him again, and once again he immediately comes back. Eventually, they decide to have his wife ride in helicopter with him to make sure she can scare him back to life if he were to code again. The guy ended up living and received a heart transplant and is still alive to this day, all thanks to his wife scaring the life back into him. Story 27. I work in maintenance in a hospital, but this story comes from out of work hours. Back in November, my grandfather passed away. He had been living in a care home for several years now, and as we were from a smaller city, his main care aide was actually an ex's mother who I am still close to. Nearing his final days, she texted me that things weren't looking good, and to get my mom, who works out of town, and myself to see him ASAP. The next 2 nights were exhaustive. Her and I barely left his bedside. We were wetting his lips, rubbing his head, and singing Charlie Pride, and telling him stories from my childhood and from my mom's. At 1